I'm Larry Ray, President and CEO of American Manganese, Inc., listed on the TSX Venture, ticker symbol AMY, A-M-Y, with proprietary patents in the U.S., China, and South Africa. Our focus is on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. China recently legislated the responsibility for recycling onto their electric vehicle manufacturers and importers. For more information, please visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Ray, at 778-574-4444.
You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Welcome to HowStreet.com radio, the online source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is James Corbett, publisher of the CorbettReport.com and editorial writer for the International Forecaster. He's speaking to us from Japan. Welcome to the show, James.
Glad to be here. Thank you again for having me on.
The first thing we wanted to talk about is the changing face of the dispute between ISIS and the rest of the world, it seems, and then Turkey shooting down a Russian jet that they say was in their territory. The Russians say it wasn't. What's this done to international relations and the so-called joint fight against ISIS?
Well, so-called joint fight, I think, is the right way of putting it, because if the entry of the really stunning military entry of Russia into this conflict in the last couple of months tells us anything, it's that all of the rhetoric about how all of this is about trying to get rid of the Islamic State, really has been hypocrisy and is not really what this is about, because obviously if that was the deal, then it wouldn't be so difficult for the U.S.-led coalition to cooperate with the Russians in what they're doing. But obviously that is not happening. So there are clearly other interests at work here, and it's not difficult to really parse what those different interests are and where they come from. In fact, General Wesley Clark was just on CNN saying that there's no dispute that Saudi Arabia and Turkey have been covertly aiding ISIS since their creation, since their inception a few years ago. So this isn't something that's, and it's been talked about before by American officials as well, including even Joe Biden having alluded to it once and having to rein in his remarks for diplomatic reasons. But everyone knows that Turkey and Saudi Arabia have been providing covert aid to ISIS in various forms, and that they have their own forces in the country, including the Turkmen there in the Latakia area where this incident happened, which of course is are ethnically related to the Turks. And that's exactly why this is a very sensitive issue, and why Turkey probably acted in the manner that they did. The other, of course, side of this is, as always, the oil, which is being sold by ISIS, as we're told, to the tune of $1.5 million a day into black markets that are smuggled out and smuggled through Turkey out into the legitimate oil world. And, Russia is cutting into that business every time they bomb the ISIS oil trucks and tankers and infrastructure. So there's a lot of interest here. And this obviously creates a huge rift, not only between Russia and NATO, but specifically Russia and Turkey, because even as late as a few days ago, Russia was reaffirming that they were 100% interested in continuing the talks with Turkey to do the Turk-Stream pipeline as their counterpart to the South Stream pipeline that was kiboshed by Brussels several months ago. They immediately started talking with Turkey, saying, "Well, we'll run our pipeline through Turkey to get our oil into southern Europe there." But that looks like that's completely off the table by this point. So this has caused a huge rift in relations, and it will be very interesting to see where this goes from here. I'm not expecting this will lead to any immediate military escalation, but it will certainly complicate things for all parties involved.
And we have François Hollande, the president of France, off to Moscow to talk to Putin. What kind of success is he going to look at now?
Well, I think it's completely up in the air at this point, and I think obviously Russia is going to be more reticent to deal with the NATO powers generally over what's happening there, and the fact that NATO is potentially gearing up some sort of response. At least Turkey did call a consultation with NATO in a result of this. So France will have to deal with that baggage in anything that they're doing in talking with Russia. And it seems that Russia it has been and continues to be one of the only parties that truly is targeting ISIS's oil infrastructure. We had the top-ranking CIA official come out a few days ago to say that the United States hasn't been targeting ISIS's oil, i.e. its main source of revenue, because they're worried about causing long-term problems for Syria, which is kind of strange considering the whole point of U.S. involvement in Syria in the first place is to get rid of their government. One would assume they're not so squeamish about doing things like destroying infrastructure, which has been happening in the country for several years anyway. So it smacks of protectionism, and I think Putin is just calling out the unfair dealing that he's seeing in all of this, and that's why recently he called out 40 nations, including G20 members, for helping to finance ISIS.
Right, and of course, Russia wants people to buy their oil. Turkey buys 60% of their energy from Russia. Could the Russians cut Turkey off from their energy as they go into winter?
It's always one of the things that Russia has up its sleeve for at least the people in its geographical area. It's certainly something that could develop as a result of this. One imagines that this has been a fundamental rift in Turkish-Russian relations, and it's not over yet because they're still operating in a very contentious area where it is next to Russia's interest in Syria in the Latakia port area, and that's exactly where the Turkmen are operating. So it is very likely that there's going to be continued conflict of some sort, and one wonders how they're going to sort this out. But it can it's almost impossible to imagine that this is going to lead to business as usual in terms of energy supplies and or business relations between the two countries.
25,000 Syrians who thought maybe they'd be in Canada by the end of the year have been told, hold on a second, maybe 10,000 by the end of the year. And now we're told maybe the end of February, maybe the end of next year for 25,000, and young men should not apply. Is this going to really help create good relations? Because yes, young men might be the biggest security risk, but if you want to maybe change attitudes, welcome people.
Right. Well, what it really does bring to the question: what is the point of what's happening here, and who put their political foot in their mouth, offering more than they could deliver? And I don't think this is new, but of course it's all part of the politics of the situation. And obviously, in the wake of what happened in Paris, there's going to be more reticence on the part of the general public. So there's less of a sort of public support for a decision like this. So of course now they're putting on the brakes, and it's just more of the political mealy-mouthed turning back on promises that we've seen so many times from both sides of the political aisle for, well, in perpetuity, really.
Well, yes.
So I don't think there's anything surprising there.
I was going to say, well, a lot of politicians have ideas, and then of course it's just like the old TV show, Yes, Minister. Yeah, you can bring in that policy, but of course it means the country will go bankrupt.
Yeah.
Yeah, so once you see the real numbers, plus they're claiming the conservatives left a horrible fiscal picture for the liberals to deal with before they've even enacted their policies, which they said would cost billions of dollars. China has, of course, changed its one-child policy to 2 children. What's going to be the long-term effect of that, and why did they do that?
Well, surprisingly, it's actually not going to have a huge effect. There is going to be an increase in births, but actually the main increase will be happening in the next few years, and it will be a decreasing return after that. Why they did this is because the demographics in China, like, well, a lot of other countries, including, of course, here in Japan, are such that there is now an aging society in China, and that's going to create a demographic crunch as that aging society is supported by fewer and fewer people of working age population. There's actually something of an underpopulation crisis that's coming behind this wave of what has long been touted as an overpopulation crisis. So the interesting part of all of this is, in fact, that the original overpopulation problem of China was not was part of a government push in the Mao era for people to have more children, because there was a depopulation of sorts that took place during the fighting that led to the creation of the installment of the Communist Party. So now there was a big push in the 50s and 60s to have a lot of children, and when that was responded to by the population, suddenly they had too many children to deal with. So they instituted the one-child policy. Now the interesting thing is the population was actually already falling, or the birth rate, I should say, the fertility rate was already falling before the one-child policy was instituted. And in fact, when it was instituted, the fertility rate actually stabilized and even went up a little bit before falling again in the 1980s and into the 90s. So it's one of those things that just goes to prove the rule, really, that central planning is almost always wrong and almost always has the opposite effect of what is wanted here. So now they're projecting that there will be, I believe it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 million extra births as a result of this new two-child policy in the next 20 years. But it is a dwindling return situation where there will be fewer increases in babies born each year after the subsequent year. And the one-child policy had already been pockmarked with enough exceptions, for example, for people living in the countryside or for people whose first baby was a girl, they could have a second baby, things of that nature. There had already been enough exceptions added that by this point, it's not going to make a huge difference to Chinese society.
And of course, China has this problem with young women in rural areas being kidnapped because they have a shortage of young women.
Exactly right. In fact, that's exactly why those amendments to the one-child policy were instituted, because again, like central planning always does, it creates problems where none existed before. So when people are limited to one child, of course, they don't want that one child to be a girl. They want a boy to carry on the family line and to earn the money and so they don't have to pay dowries, for example, in India and places like that. So it often tends to come to a type of gender genocide, and that was what was happening largely in China until they started to allow some exceptions. For example, for the first child being born a girl, they could have the second child and things of that nature, because really there is a huge discrepancy right now between the male-female ratio. In fact, it's 1.16, which is extremely unbalanced. There's a lot more men than women in China right now.
Did China release its 5-year plan?
Yes, it did. Well, no, it didn't release it in the sense that it's open to public scrutiny, but they certainly did have their conference, and the two-child policy is one of the things that has come out of that. It will be tabled as legislation for the National Congress to rubber stamp approve next spring. So that's the point at which we'll get to really see and pry and look under the hood. In the meantime, various Chinese governmental agencies will be releasing a lot of jargon-laden reports that will drop some of the details of this, but really the meat and potatoes will be passed at the National Congress next March.
And speaking of jargon, the real wording in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, when we come back to James Corbett after the break.
I'm Larry Ray, President and CEO of American Manganese, Inc., listed on the TSX Venture, ticker symbol AMY, A-M-Y, with proprietary patents in the U.S., China, and South Africa. Our focus is on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. China recently legislated the responsibility for recycling onto their electric vehicle manufacturers and importers. For more information, please visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Ray, at 778-574-4444.
More and more people are looking to the internet for intelligent, riveting, and thought-provoking interviews. To advertise on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com, call 604-699-8600, 604-699-8600.
Welcome back. We're speaking with James Corbett. One of the headlines on your website, Terrible TPP. The Trans-Pacific Partnership Clauses explained in plain English. What are some of the terrible parts?
One of the ones that everyone was talking about and fearing before the TPP was released was the investor state dispute settlement mechanism, which is an incredible mouthful, and the legalese and jargon in the actual text of the TPP make it almost discernible what they're even referring to. If an investment dispute has not been resolved within 6 months of the receipt by the respondent of a written request for consultations pursuant to Article 9.17.2, consultation and negotiation, etc., etc., etc. It's the type of legalese that no one can really wade through. It's designed to be written specifically for the policymakers and the rule makers, not for the general public. So it's difficult for people to understand this. But basically, I mean, in a nutshell, this is the mechanism through which corporations that are unhappy with laws that are passed in any of the TPP member nations can use their perceived future loss of profits from those laws or regulations as a basis for suing those governments. And again, this is not a theoretical type of thing. This is something that already occurs under a very little-known mechanism that already exists called the Convention on the Settlement of Investment Disputes Between States and Nationals of Other States. It's kind of a secret legal alternative legal system that most people don't know exists, but it allows, for example, companies like Vattenfall, which is a Swedish energy company, to sue the German government for $6 billion in losses from the German government's decision after Fukushima to move off of nuclear power. Vattenfall had some contracts with the German government that they say it was going to earn them $6 billion over the lifetime of the contract, fulfilling that for the German government. But now that that's being canceled because the German government is changing its policies, Vattenfall wants to be able to get that money back from the German people. So they're now suing the German government. And that's just one example. There are many examples of this mechanism being used, and the TPP codifies that for the TPP area, so that corporations within that area can sue governments around the area for perceived lack of profit from regulations and laws.
Now, I seem to recall Australia had a trade agreement with China that allowed similar things to happen, except it was always China suing them, and they weren't allowed to sue China, so they bailed from that agreement. Do you think Mr. Trudeau might take a look at this and say there's a lot of bad deals in this from Canada, we're not going to approve it? Or if you're going to trade on the Pacific, you have no choice but to join up with 40% of the world?
Well, I don't believe the treaty is open to amendment at this point. It's either accept it or reject it. And there's almost no conceivable way in which we can imagine that the Trudeau government is going to reject it. So I think it's already baked into the cake. And the supporters of this would say, well, it's not going to be that type of one-sided system because everyone has equal access to this World Bank secret court mechanism, this Convention on the Settlement of Investment Disputes. There's equal access for all corporations. So, Canada can benefit from this as well, or Canadian corporations can benefit, would be the tagline.
Another one of your headlines, the art bubble is about to burst. Explain that.
Well, one of the real, I think, indicators of a general inflationary bubble is what happens in the art markets can really give a window into what's happening generally speaking. And it's one subsection of the luxury goods economy, which provides an idea of how the higher strata of society, as measured, of course, by their net value, are doing in business. And one example of that is in the 1980s when we saw the bubble running up in Japan, for example. We suddenly saw a bunch of Japanese investors appear on the art market scene, spending record amounts of money on paintings. And as soon as the Nikkei bubble burst in 1990, of course, art prices tended to return back downwards. It's not a very complicated mechanism to understand. And similarly, in the wake of the bubble that we're having right now in equities, as a result of the 2008 collapse and the QE that followed from it, we're seeing, again, similarly, a bubble in art prices. So I can't remember the specific example right now, but it was a painting just sold for, I think, the second most that has ever been sold in a public auction, and it was somewhere in the neighborhood of $170 million. I don't know if you have the number in front of you, but an incredible amount of money to pay for a painting. And again, it just shows that that is the general trend, and there are a number of different indicators of that trend. Not only the fact that I believe 5 of the 10 of the top selling art pieces in the world of all time, adjusted for inflation, have been sold in the last 2 years. But also, one of the major auction houses sold $1 billion worth of art in a single week, breaking its all-time record earlier this year. Things of that nature. So there's a lot of indication that, again, the art bubble is in a market, and it's just a window into the general equities bubble that's been taking place in the QE hyperinflationary world that we are in at the moment.
Well, it's also an illustration of the 1% of the people in the world who own half the world's wealth. I mean, what are they going to do with all that money if they're not going to buy pretty pictures? I
mean, that's important to point out because, again, this is part of that luxury goods economy, which is supposedly going to be an indicator of, well, if these people are doing well, then the trickle down, it will do well for everyone. But as I think a lot of people who feel this at the lower ends of the economy understand, that's not always the case. And in fact, this can be really wasted. And one example of that at least threw the art world into a fit last year was this Chinese investor who just bought that $170 million Modigliani painting last year, bought a porcelain cup, a Ming Dynasty porcelain cup, for $36.3 million and at an auction, and then tweeted out a photo of himself drinking tea from this $36 million cup there at the auction house, which enraged art aficionados, as well as I think anyone who sees that kind of conspicuous consumption, raised the ire of a lot of people who are struggling to make ends meet and watching someone sipping out of his $36 million cup. It certainly it doesn't seem to be something that belies a healthiness or a good standing of the overall economy.
Maclean's magazine in Canada published an article, "What use does Vancouver pose for the rest of Canada? It's quickly becoming a playground for just the rich and famous." I said, well, what use does Monaco play then? Because that's all that is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Exactly right. I mean, it certainly is pricing itself out of the market for anything but people who have conspicuous amounts of money to spend around. It's like any other bubble, though. I mean, at some point, what goes up comes down, and when they price themselves out of that market, it will adjust, and that adjustment is often painful for a lot of people. But I don't think anyone will be crying tears for some of the rich and famous jet setters who are going to lose out on their investments when the bubble starts to contract.
I know they say places like Manhattan, Vancouver, London, the real estate market is bulletproof, but didn't they used to say that about Tokyo as well?
Yes. In fact, I think one of the best signs that a bubble is coming to the point where it's going to burst is when they start to say, but this time it's different, or this time it can't burst, or in this place it's a special rule. And in fact, it was recently said that was the exact thing that was argued about the art bubble. No, this time it's different. It's not going to pop, which I think is probably a good indication that it will. But it's important to keep in mind that London and Vancouver and these types of property markets are greatly skewed by a lot of hot money coming in from around the world. In London, you've got a lot of Russian money that's trying to escape Russia and the Russian economy generally. In Vancouver, of course, you have Chinese money coming in that's greatly skewing the market and is not really a reflection of people looking for actual housing. It's people looking for places to park hot money.
James, anything else you wanted to bring up today?
There's an awful lot going on in the world right now, but something that I do have my eye on is the Paris Climate Conference that's going to be starting in a few days, and that potentially will, if not hammer out if it won't hammer out a legally binding treaty, it is certainly at least going to aim at that and to aim at the installation of, or at least create the space for more types of carbon taxes like what we're seeing instituted now in Alberta, of all places. So I think there's some big movements being made on that front, and that's what I'm going to be covering on the website in the next few weeks.
And, of course, I want to ask, how real is climate change with Antarctica actually gaining ice?
Well, that's a very good question. Yes, NASA has just released a new study showing that although they've been claiming for years that Antarctica has been losing land ice, and land ice, of course, is important because losing land ice means that it's contributing to sea level rise. Well, now they're saying, actually, we made a mistake, and in fact, it's been gaining land ice not only for all the time we've been saying it's losing, but for the last 10,000 years or so. So there has been a monumental shift, but for some reason, for some strange reason, not only does that headline not get reported nearly as much as the opposite tends to get reported, but also people who have been ringing the alarm about things like losing land ice are not assuaged by this. They're not celebrating this, which I find strange, because if you are truly concerned about the end of the planet, you should be happy about things that indicate maybe the planet isn't dying in the way we thought it was. But unfortunately, what few people fail to really appreciate is how many, really at this point, trillions of dollars of resources are being committed to fighting this climate change. So there are a lot of not only individuals, not only corporations, but now entire industries that are being built around this. And that's why I think there were a lot of vested interests in keeping that gravy train rolling by making the headlines and the dire predictions as bad as possible.
And of course, they don't mention that one volcanic eruption in one day will spew out more CO2 than what has been accounted for in the last 10 years of carbon trading.
If they could find a way to tax the volcano, I'm sure that would be a major headline. But since they can't, we'll just keep it based on humans.
James, thank you very much.
Thank you.
My guest has been James Corbett, publisher of thecorbettreport.com and editorial writer for the International Forecaster. He was speaking to us from Japan. You're listening to HowStreet.com radio. Find us on Twitter at Talk Digital Net. Our popular YouTube channel is Talk Digital Network. Comments about the show can be sent to info@HowStreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard.
Comments made on HowStreet.com radio are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any matter whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. HowStreet.com radio is a production of HowStreet Media Incorporated.